Why do you think DC is so, to use your term, unprofessional? Why do you think there's this massive lack of seriousness?
Because there's so very few members, staff, bureaucrats serving the executive branch that have any experience in, which means little knowledge of, and maybe even more importantly, very little sympathy for the private sector. They look at the easy money made by these big tech billionaires. Well, business is easy. Business is our cash cow. Yeah. I mean, business is these are the entities that price gouge, and so we're the angels here. We're the really smart people to make sure that these evil business people don't price gouge our voters. We're going to be the ones that command these economies, and they don't have a clue. They don't have a clue. I think the other thing is because they've never been in the private sector, they've never even been part of a functioning organization. Now, I think the bureaucrats, you've got the agencies that they're probably, they're functioning organizations, okay? But Congress, I mean, I've never seen anything this dysfunctional.
Howdy, everyone. Welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Saurabh Sharma. I'm the president of American Moment, and I'm joined by
Nick Solheim, the COO of American Moment.
And we are here for the season finale of season 3 of Moment of Truth. Thank you guys for listening to us all season. We had a very exciting guest on today, but before I get to that, be sure as always to go to AmericanMoment.org. There you can find everything that we have cooking, new programs, old programs, the backlog of this show, all the news articles being written about us, and so much more. I think we're basically done on our spring fellowship for American Statecraft, but guess what? We have summer up now too. So go ahead, start applying for that, fill out the interest form, fill out the application. Let's start getting applications in for that. We want to bring you to Washington. If you want to come a different way, just get a job here. Go to AmericanMoment.org/join. Today we had on a very exciting guest. Senator Ron Johnson came to Washington in 2010 after a successful 30-plus year career in manufacturing because he believed the federal government was bankrupting America. And he has now served in many, many different roles as a senator, and most recently as the chairman of the Senate's Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee from 2015 to 2021, and now is the ranking member on the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. He also serves on the Budget and Finance Committees. He was elected to his third term in November of 2022, which, is kind of interesting. Republicans have pretensions to win national elections. It seems to me that a lot of our math runs through the upper Midwest, and there is one statewide elected Republican left in the upper Midwest. So I think we should listen to him. Unfortunately, a lot of people in Washington don't tend to do so. I just thought it was a fantastic episode. We talked about his approach on debt and deficits, what he thinks the crises facing the country are, how full of rage our response to the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically on vaccines, made him, and what he thinks we should be doing about Ukraine. I thought it was a fantastic episode. What do you think, Nick?
It was the moment that really got my goat was when we were talking about vaccines killing people, and then we started talking about all the conspiracies around the JFK assassination. You're definitely going to want to hang through until that, probably around the 40-minute mark or so. Fantastic episode, covered a wide variety of topics. It was very, he kept apologizing for being scattershot, but it's like, no, I thought it was awesome.
That's great.
Yeah, it was great.
Politicians are so boring most of the time. We had a blast. Thank you, Senator Johnson, for coming on the show. Thank you to his staff for making it happen. So we'll go now to Senator Ron Johnson. Senator Johnson, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
We always like to hear about how our guests are, the path that they took to getting to where they are today. You have an unusual one for a U.S. senator, one that gives you a different perspective on this town. Tell us that story. Why on earth would you have subjected yourself to elected office?
Well, I'm an accountant by education, ran a manufacturing plant for 30-some years, and it was really part of the Tea Party movement. I'd never given a speech in public, obviously talked to my employees, but I was asked to give a speech at a Tea Party in October 2009. And they wanted me to talk about, the harmful impact of government regulation on business, which I could have spent hours talking about, but it's not what I want to talk about. And they said, well, come talk anyway. We need speakers. And so on the steps of the Oshkosh County Courthouse, where Ronald Reagan delivered part of his tax reform agenda, I basically told the story of my daughter, who was born with the transposition of the great arteries. First day of life, she had one of these marvelous doctors that President Obama had said, well, take out a set of tonsils or amputate a foot to, make a few extra bucks, basically calling doctors who dedicate their lives to saving other people's lives a bunch of greedy, money-grubbing, whats. And so I found that pretty offensive. So I told that story how, we had a doctor come in at 1:30 in the morning, did a procedure, saved her life, first day of life. Then 8 months later, when her heart was the size of a small plum, in 7 hours of open heart surgery, they rebaffled the upper chamber of her heart. So my daughter's heart operates backwards today. Wow. She's 40 years old, has 2 children through surrogacy, and she's led a pretty perfectly normal life. So I told that story, again, really pushing back on what President Obama was doing, denigrating doctors to sell us Obamacare. And after I gave that speech in October, people that I didn't even know came up to me, hey, liked your speech, why don't you run for office? Because I'm not crazy. But then they passed Obamacare on Christmas Eve, 2009. The Tea Party movement was strong. I certainly was looking at, I think back then we were $14 trillion in debt, had run our first $1 trillion deficit. We're mortgaging and plundering our children's future. I think that's immoral. Still think it is. We're not coming to grips with that. And so I primarily ran on the basis of, the platform of freedom and the immorality of mortgaging our children's future, and how Obamacare would not protect patients, would not produce affordable health care. And so I didn't decide to run till April of 2010, announced a few weeks later. Amazingly got the endorsement of the Republican Party convention, so I didn't really have a real challenging primary, so I could start running a 5 to 6 month campaign, Russ Feingold, and beat him.
Tell me about the dynamics of that race. I mean, running against a Democrat incumbent, just the insane uphill battle that can be, especially with how much more heavily resourced they are than the Republican Party. What was the dynamics? Well,
he was going for either his 3rd or 4th term. And, listen, the public just gets tired of elected officials, no matter who they are, quite honestly. And, you had a Tea Party wave. So I would say that Feingold and Democrats lost that election as opposed to, I was just fabulous and I won it. 2016, I think I won the election. But you do have to understand, in the end, elections are about getting votes. Mm-hmm. And the way you get votes is you have to have strong grassroots efforts. Messaging is important. I think ads less so. I think people are just tuning those things out. So you have to have a very strong ground game. I think awful lot of campaign consultants and candidates just simply don't understand the nuts and bolts and mechanics of actually winning a race.
Yeah, and then what they'll say back to their candidates is, you don't understand, I need a second beach home. And the way I got that is by getting a couple cents on ad spend.
But one thing I do know is if you win, the consultants take all the credit. If you lose, just bad candidate.
Yeah, I have bad candidate quality.
That's exactly right.
That's the buzzword here.
We were talking about before the show about how a lot of these consultants haven't come to you to ask, like, well, how did you do it? And you were mentioning, having a good grassroots effort. I mean, what does it look like to win in the Upper Midwest? What do you have to do? And why are other people not capable of doing it? What's your secret sauce?
First of all, I think people need to believe you're genuine. When I first ran in 2010, I only made 2 promises. I said, I'll always tell you the truth. I'll never vote, and by extension, conduct myself with my reelection in mind. Now, that was interpreted as I was only going to run first term. That's not or 1 term. That's not what I said. So I'll tell you the truth, and I won't conduct myself worrying about reelection. So I think people really do believe, whether they agree with me or not, they believe that I believe what I'm saying, that I am genuine. That's the first important part. Then secondly, in terms of the actual election mechanics, you got to work your tail off. I mean, you got to go all over the state, and you need to be willing to talk to everybody. As rotten as most of the Wisconsin press is in terms of being, radical leftists themselves, not being fair, gotcha questions all over the place. I've always made myself accessible. I take the questions, and I try and do it without getting bombastic. Just adhere to the principle of, sharpen your argument rather than raise your voice. And that's not to say that I don't get passionate, that I don't get pretty angry about things. But, I think publicly, you try and be pretty even keel. And I think that's important as well. But again, it's a strong grassroots effort. We are very fortunate in Wisconsin to have a pretty strong Republican Party. Okay. Not everybody loves it totally, but, and by the way, I still consider myself more Tea Party than Republican. But we have a two-party system here. It's far from perfect, but it works better than just about any other type of political system in the world. And, when you decide to run for a statewide office like this, you can't run as a third party. It's just not successful. You have to join. You have to align yourself with one of the two. And obviously, I am way more closely aligned with Republican Party as opposed to the Democrats who are literally destroying this country. So that was a pretty easy choice. And in Wisconsin, I think the result of that, because I am more Tea Party, and I'm recognized that way, and I joined the Republican Party, there's really a very cooperative relationship in Wisconsin between the Republican Party, we'll call it the establishment wing of the party. I think most people in the Republican Party of Wisconsin are a bunch of rabble-rousers like me, probably more aligned with Tea Party anyway. But Tea Party groups, other groups like Americans for Prosperity, Turning Point, again, we all recognize that we're on the same side, and there's not the purist movement. There is to a certain extent. There are some groups in county parties and can be somewhat disruptive, but by and large, people adhere to the concept that I'd rather align myself with somebody who agrees with me 70 or 80% of the time, as opposed to, excommunicate those people and just be my own little lonely group of one because I agree with everything I believe in.
That's fascinating. So the dynamics in the upper Midwest are interesting because you got elected first in that Tea Party wave, and then during the year of your reelect to the Senate, there was another sort of political revolution in that part of the country, which was 2016. President Trump gets elected to Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania with a very different result than was expected. Why do you think that happened? What was going on in that part of the country that ended up being so operative to the Republican Party's ability to win the presidency?
Well, I do believe that Obamacare was not popular once it was implemented. I mean, it didn't work. Premiums on the individual market skyrocketed. I think the advantage for Democrats in Obamacare is, in the end, Obamacare really impacted a pretty small percentage of the American population. I mean, it screwed up our healthcare market, was not helpful, didn't work. But the people that bore the full burden of Obamacare's misdirected, market interventions were people on the individual market, because they were asked to bear the full cost of covering people with pre-existing conditions, which, by the way, was pretty much universally accepted. I mean, Democrats lied about Republicans not wanting to cover people with pre-existing conditions. I mean, I talked about my daughter. She has a pre-existing condition. I want to make sure that she has health care, access to it, or health insurance throughout her life. So, again, that was one of the many lies that Democrats say about their political opponents. But it caused those individual premiums to skyrocket, but government picked up the tab for most people. So as much as Obamacare has failed at its mission, people never talk about it. It's just sort of just forgotten in history. And it's just one of the many barnacles that we've attached to our healthcare system that weigh it down and make it unworkable.
Well, it's interesting to hear you talk about this because I don't feel like I've heard elected Republicans talk about healthcare in like years. It's kind of we've just accepted that this is the new status quo.
Well, we utterly blew it during the Trump administration.
Yeah.
We all ran on repeal and replace, right? By the way, I always use the term, let's repair the damage done by Obamacare and transition to something that actually works. What would actually work would transition insurance into truly insurance, where it's covering catastrophic, and transition into more consumerism, through things like health savings accounts, where you reintroduce consumerism into healthcare. It's the only thing that's going to work, free market competition. That is the transition we need to make. But, all these politicians, ran on repeal and replace, and they had no replace. Mm-hmm. And, certainly McConnell couldn't manage a process in the Senate, nor could Paul Ryan. I mean, the healthcare the House passed was awful. I mean, it's awful. I mean, in many ways, it was a horrible solution. They just didn't take a look at the reality. They didn't take a look at what opportunities it offered, because Obamacare is high deductible plans. Okay, so utilize those, and underneath there, bring in health savings accounts, again, I'm not saying the transition is easy, but I know how I would have gone about doing it. But the original group that McConnell appointed in the Senate to his working group on Obamacare excluded me, excluded I think Senator Perdue. I mean, the few of us that came from the private sector that knew something about it. I mean, I bought healthcare for 30 some years, bought health insurance for. I knew a fair amount about what works, what doesn't work, how screwed up the market was, and what we needed to fix it. Wasn't even included. I forced my way into a process that he just ignored anyway. So again, I mean, what I can't overemphasize is how utterly unprofessional Washington is. There may be some professionalism in agencies, but when it comes to Congress, I mean, pardon my French here, it's just half. You don't have organized discussions the way you would in the private sector. Mm-hmm. One of the points I made last December when we were arguing over the omnibus, if you remember that, I asked my Republican colleagues, anybody know how much we spent last year in total? I just got pretty much blank stares.
About $2 trillion.
I gave them, but now I'm going to embarrass you. I gave them absolute or absolution right away because I wouldn't expect because we never talk about it. Yeah. Mm. The answer was $6.2 trillion. Yeah. I went out later on and asked the press the same thing. I got a similar answer. It's over $1 trillion. No, that's discretionary spending. You're talking about discretionary spending. I'm talking about in total. Right now we went from in 2019 $4.4 trillion in spending to now we've got a new baseline of 6.4 in 4 years. And my colleagues always say, well, there's nothing we can do about it because it's discretionary. It's always the mandatory spending. Well, during those 4 years, somehow we allowed other mandatory spending, other than Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So other mandatory spending to increase over $500 billion over 4 years. So again, if the problem is mandatory, again, it's really hard to address Social Security, Medicare. Okay, at a minimum, don't keep adding other kind of spending to mandatory. That's just out of control. We never look at it because it's mandatory. I mean, that is why the federal government is out of control. And by the way, you throw interest into mandatory spending as well. And now that's up to last year, $650 billion on a path to over $1 trillion, on a path to exceed what we spend on Social Security. But the point I was making is that here we are, basically the board of directors of the largest financial entity in the world. Okay? There's nothing larger than the U.S. government. And the board of directors doesn't even know what that financial entity spends annually. Now, they're starting to know because I made the point last December. So more of my colleagues know. We're starting to focus on that. And that's the first step in solving this problem is look at the entire budget and try and start doing something about it. But again, most people say, no, let's wall off. We're not going to touch that. Okay, well, then we are going to have a debt crisis at some point in time.
So it's fascinating the way that you envision what the Senate is, board of directors of the largest financial entity in the world. You don't hear people talking that way about it. I think it's a very interesting way to put it because it places an awesomeness on the responsibility of what being U.S. Senator is.
Let me use just one more point on that. Right now, we're arguing Ukraine funding versus, securing the border. So, Leader McConnell has appointed, didn't ask my opinion. I was chairman of Homeland Security for 6 years. Hey, you want to help negotiate border security? No, he selected his team. And I keep making the point, okay, well, does the negotiating team know what the conference position is on securing the border? Or have we vested all of our authority in people that I didn't select to negotiate for us? And again, I think they're fine people and, knowledgeable about the border and all that. But our position is quite muddled in the Republican conference in terms of what we would require for border security in exchange for Ukraine funding. I mean, I'm there pushing for what I want. I couldn't tell you what the conference position is. I mean, that's how, pardon my French, half the discussion and the leadership is. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, but is that a bug or a feature, right? Is the process designed to actually involve the collaboration of all, 50-something Republican senators?
No, I mean, that's exactly the way Leader McConnell wants it. He says, it's not a dictatorship. No, it really is. Mm-hmm. It's his way, and he just maneuvers to get his way. Mm-hmm. And as a result, what we have seen time and time again, where the leader leads a process where you get all 51 Democrats and just enough Republicans to make sure the Democrats get their priority. I mean, that's got to end. I mean, I point that out to my colleagues all the time that we can't let that happen. They say, oh, we're not going to let it happen this time. And then, it happens again. So we need to stop that process. We need a different governing model for the Republican conference, which is, I was one of the leaders of the effort to, and I appreciate that Rick Scott was willing to run as leader, knowing pretty full well that he wasn't going to win because he hadn't raised the money that McConnell had raised to help elect people. So it was a problem.
So that was the moment of sort of first blood drawn. I mean, I remember when Senator Scott threw his hat into the ring. It was an important first salvo. What's the next one going to be? How are the good guys in the Senate going to force a change to this process in the coming years? I mean, we spent the last year, the House is going through its growing pains trying to find a way to approach a more transparent, legible process where members actually get to participate. What's your dream for how we do that in the Senate?
Well, we are making changes in the Senate right now. I mean, for example, Leader McConnell was all for continuing resolution that included $6 billion for Ukraine funding. I mean, he was making that pitch the day we actually voted down that continuing resolution. Mm-hmm. Because in the conference at lunch, those of us who were opposed to that prevailed. And in the end, I think he even voted to deny cloture on that bill that he was pushing. So, I'm doing everything I can to force a different governing model, a more collaborative model on the conference.
Why do you think DC is so, to use your term, unprofessional? Why do you think there's this massive lack of seriousness?
Because there are so very few members, staff, bureaucrats serving the executive branch that have any experience in, which means little knowledge of, and maybe even more importantly, very little sympathy for the private sector. They look at the easy money made by these big tech billionaires. Well, business is easy. Business is our cash cow. Yeah. I mean, business is these are the entities that price gouge, and so we're the angels here. We're the really smart people to make sure that these evil business people don't price gouge our voters. We're going to be the ones that command these economies, and they don't have a clue. They don't have a clue. I think the other thing is. Because they've never been in the private sector, they've never even been part of a functioning organization. Now, I think the bureaucrats, you've got the agencies that they're probably, they're functioning organizations, okay? But Congress, I mean, I've never seen anything this dysfunctional that are dealing with such important issues. I mean, this is grotesquely dysfunctional. That's why, I wasn't going to run for a third term. I mean, I had enough of it. But, in the end, I couldn't turn my back on this country, and nobody else was advocating for the vaccine injured. So I did decide to run for another term. The day after I won the election, I wrote a column that Wall Street Journal ran it. I said, this is the way to restore some function, hopefully some fiscal discipline to Congress. And so I just laid out. So we've got a debt ceiling debate coming up. So let's get something for it. I proposed Preventing Government Shutdown Act, Full Faith and Credit, the No Default Act, the REINS Act, and also reduce the size of the federal government through Attrition Act. You don't have to fire anybody, just quit hiring them, okay? So those are 4 structural reforms that I would have, if I were in charge, I would have pushed to attach to a debt ceiling. And then pass a budget and have that budget guide and appropriation process. But you got to start, February, March, April, and then have those appropriation bills. That didn't happen. McCarthy didn't make sure the House passed them. McConnell certainly wasn't pushing Schumer to do it in the Senate. So here we are. Took up our first appropriation bill in September. The fiscal year ends September 30th. We're going to go home for Christmas. We're still operating continuing resolutions. My guess is we'll have a year-long continuing resolution because I don't see the Senate. We passed one minibus, and we haven't brought anything else up. So again. Schumer and McConnell, they've got this well-honed process for Mortgage on Your Kids' Future. And it's about omnibuses. It's about, not a real functioning process where there's more collaboration. It's just that they'll write the omnibus spending bill, drop it on our desk, multi-thousand-page bills, and then expect us to vote for it because we want to go home for Christmas. Well, Speaker Johnson broke that up by doing a continuing resolution in January and February. So we're going to go home for Christmas. There's really no drama this year, which I appreciate, but I don't appreciate the continuing dysfunction.
It's interesting. I've never been in a city where its inhabitants think so highly of themselves while being so mediocre, to your point. It's a very, very dysfunctional town. How do you think about staffing in general, expertise, et cetera, not just in your own, Senate office, but in Congress, in the administration? What needs to change about staffing in this town?
Well, first of all, there are a lot of good people here in town. Okay, again, I don't want to they're good people. They're smart people. They're hardworking people. That's, members of Congress, that's staff. Again, it's just that they don't have the experience. Staff members coming right out of college and, poli-sci or comms or whatever. And again, smart, bright people. I like working with them. I give them assignments. They do good research for me, that kind of stuff. But again, it's not like you've got somebody with decades of experience in the private sector that really understands what an onerous tax system does to just business decision-making. And they don't have experience. So that's the main problem, is you just don't have, as I said, the experience, knowledge, or sympathy for the private sector. And that's a killer. I don't care how smart, how hardworking, how well-intentioned you are, you need experience. And we just don't have it here in Washington, D.C.
Do you think we have a compensation problem in Washington?
No, we have a government's way too big problem. That's the root cause. Our founders never envisioned a federal government this large. It wasn't much more than 100 years ago when the federal government was 2% of our economy. And state and local governments were about 5%. That's pretty much the vision of the founding fathers. Government close to the government in the sovereign states. Local and state government that's closer to the government, more efficient, more effective, more accountable. We've turned that constitutional premise on its head. And now the federal government is about 25% of our GDP. State and local governments, I think, somewhere around 15%. For now, total state governments, again, these are old, somewhere around 40%. That's massive. I think one of my first Tea Party speeches I gave is, I mentioned that for a brief moment in time under Ronald Reagan, we were 72% free because the federal tax was it was 28%, and it's a direct proportion. Freedom is directly proportional to how much the government can take from you. And back then, the government could take 28% and no more. But when government at all levels is taking 40%, I don't know, are you even feeling 60% free? People ought to think about that.
So you mentioned that part of the reason you chose to run again, and I've heard from some of your colleagues about this as well, is how badly across American life we bungled the COVID-19 pandemic. Tell me what it was like as that was beginning, and what immediately began to concern you about our response, and why that has really motivated your service.
So the best way to explain is kind of, I was chairman of Homeland Security. Now, I was holding hearings that the Help Committee should have been doing, but they weren't. So early February, this was right after, just now as the pandemic, I held a hearing with Scott Gottlieb, other former CDC officials, that type of thing. And the main takeaway about there is we don't produce the precursor chemicals or the active pharmaceutical ingredients for drugs. We just don't do it. We've done nothing to address that in the intervening 3 years. You pass a $1 trillion infrastructure bill. You think we did anything to bring some chemical refineries so we can do precursor chemicals? And no, we haven't done anything. So again, we recognize the problem and we ignore it, okay, until it blows up on our face. So again, that's the first thing. Then very early on, you had Johnny Ioannidis analyze the Princess Cruise. That was a perfect research test right there, right? And he found out that, this is a deadly disease if you're elderly, as the flu can be, or certain comorbidities. But if you're young and healthy, it's going to be like the flu. And we knew that early on. So I actually wrote a column because I was the guy who spouted off saying, listen, we tragically lose tens of thousands of people on the highway every year, but we don't shut down the highways. We can't. I did that in March, and then Fauci, ripped me from the podium. So that's way out there. No, it was a good analogy. So USA Today asked me to write a column on keeping the economy open, which I did. They give you 300 words. You don't get to see their counter argument about closing it down. They get about 800 words. I get 300. So I just got savage for that. That ran March 30th of 2020. I'm very proud of that column. And then I followed that up with a hearing with Johnny Ioannidis, but also with a fellow that I'd never heard of, Pierre Corey. He was associated with the University of Wisconsin, and he was proposing treatment using corticosteroids. So I not only brought in Johnny Unitas, some other experts to just try and calm people down. This isn't SARS, it's not MERS, it's not Ebola. It could be a really bad flu. Okay, so it's not worth freaking out about. I mean, take precautions. Okay, we ought to be exploring early treatment. We ought to be, letting doctors be doctors and practice medicine and use this marvel of the internet to communicate with each other. That was all shut down. But this was May, where Pierre Corey came out and talked about his success using corticosteroids. He was vilified for about 8 weeks until then there was a study out of the UK that said dexamethasone, which actually works. Now they underdosed it for the rest of the pandemic. I then got connected to, a growing group of global doctors and medical researchers. Peter McCulloch, I brought him in with Harvey Risch and George Freed. They're successfully treating people with the hydroxychloroquine and Z-Pak and zinc. And then the following month, they brought in Pierre Corey again talking about ivermectin. So that was November, December of the pandemic. And I'm still going, why aren't we pursuing early treatment? It was baffling to me. And the evidence, was very strong, plus just anecdotally, because I'm doing this, I'm getting people all the time. I could connect them to doctors. I'm hearing stories of just tremendous turnaround. People can't breathe and they get ivermectin with a fatty food and, within hours, I can breathe again. I mean, I'm hearing this repeatedly. So I'm convinced, okay. And I think the studies are out there, but all that was sabotaged by the FDA. By social media, by the trusted news network, all that kind of stuff. Why? So, I mean, again, when things don't make sense to me, I start getting pretty suspicious. And of course, I think we know now this was all about pushing a vaccine. You go back to October 2019, a couple weeks before the event 201, and you've got Rick Bright, who wrote the emergency use authorization for hydroxychloroquine to sabotage it because he only used it as a trial in the hospital, which is too late. Mm-hmm. But he's with Anthony Fauci at the Milken Institute saying, we just have never been able to achieve a universal vaccination program, and we need one. It'll probably take a pandemic. Well, by God, they got one, okay? Yeah. And then you look at 201, which the primary takeaway about there is you got Avril Haines, now our Director of National Intelligence. She's primarily focused on misinformation, what we can do to basically censor Americans. How can we censor doctors? How can we vilify doctors that aren't towing the company line here? So, the tragedy is, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives not being adequately treated. We push something like remdesivir, which is highly profitable for the drug companies and for people that are associated with it. I mean, the conflicts of interest of that approval are unbelievable, but that stays under the radar. We pushed the vaccines. We completely ignored the safety signals that were screaming at us. I just started publishing the VAERS data, comparing the FAERS.
That's the taboo word. You can't say that around town.
The FAERS, which is the FDA advert, on drugs. So I would compare that with ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, Tylenol, flu vaccine, and it was just stark. I started asking, I had a meeting with Francis Collins, a bunch of other Republican senators. They're just all patting themselves in the back because, hey, we got those tests out there. What good's a test when you don't do anything with it?
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm the one that said, well, Dr. Collins, are you looking at what VAERS is telling you? I mean, that back then we had about a few thousand deaths on VAERS, dramatic increase over what you see with flu vaccines. And 40% of those deaths at that time were occurring on days 0, 1, or 2. And he said, well, Senator, we've looked at these and we've got 6 deaths associated with the J&J vaccine on clotting, of women of child age-bearing years, or childbearing age. But other than that, he said, Senator, people die. That's how cavalier. So we're up to over 36,000 deaths now worldwide on VAERS. It's about 24% now because now we're giving them to young people. They're healthier. They can withstand the assault on the gene therapy. And 24% of those are occurring on either the day of vaccination or within 2 days. Now, again, that's a safety signal screaming at you. I always get pushback. Well, yeah, but we gave billions of doses. Okay, let's take a look at it on a per dose basis, okay? So I finally did that calculation. It's hard to get the number of doses of flu vaccine. You've got number of distributed. So I'm assuming 70% of distributed flu vaccines over a 10-year period were actually injected. Okay, that's my assumption. The number of deaths per million doses of the COVID vaccine is 25.5. The number of deaths per million doses of flu vaccine over 10 years, assuming 70% injection based on distribution, is 0.46.
100.
That's a 55-fold increase of deaths per million doses, and nothing to see there. I've written letters to the FDA on hot lots. Obvious. There's one lot that has this was over 2 years ago, probably. There was one lot that had over 5,000 serious adverse events associated with it, okay? Compared to the highest flu lot, over 26, 27, 28 years, it was 137. There are hundreds of lots of the COVID vaccine that has over 500 adverse events associated. It's just stark. So it takes me a year to get a response from the FDA, and the response is, we don't see any difference. We don't see any lot variation. Again, I come from manufacturing. Yeah. That is a process out of control. When you've got, I think it's 80% of all adverse events are occurring in like 5% of the lots. And I can't remember the exact. It's in my letter, but it's the adverse events are, and that's the good news. Quite honestly, if you did get the vax, it does seem there were some bad lots or hot lots that cause most of the serious adverse events and deaths. And I'm hoping that's true, because I know a lot of people I love that also got vaccinated.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about your rationale behind this, and all these studies and all this work that you've put into studying these adverse effects. And the YouTube video of this will probably be taken down. They called you a science denier, right? And you've been so focused on like the actual data, and they're the science deniers. It's just crazy.
Well, I mean, right now, if you haven't read RFK Jr.'s new book, it just came out. I got an advanced copy. Read it. Rand Paul has a book kind of laying this out. I mean, we are getting more and more evidence. You got the House committee that has got some Slack messages, and but to me, it's been so obvious. I mean, the minute those Fauci emails were FOIA'd, even the heavily redacted state, it's just obvious. These guys knew how incriminating their funding of the Wuhan lab through EcoHealth Alliance was. And, they've been covering up ever since. I mean, it's interesting, of all the government agencies that would know what happened. I mean, the government agency that know the most is the CIA.
Yeah.
I mean, they through USAID, they've been funding, bioweapon research. That's what it is. I mean, they're saying as well, in case some crazy person were to use CRISPR technology and splice genes and create a chimeric virus. I mean, we got to be prepared for it. So we got to know how to create a vaccine, right? That's the rationale. Well, so then they go out and they create dangerous chimeric viruses that produce a vaccine or produce a pandemic, and they know it. And so the CIA is well aware of this. They remain the agency that's still clinging to, this sprung from nature. And now we found out, good work, oversight by the House, that I think 6 of the 7 people tasked in the CIA for figuring out, is this, what is the origin of COVID, were bribed to change their opinion from sprang from a lab. And so again, there is so much corruption. Here's a pretty good figure too. Obviously, I knew that Anthony Fauci had funded EcoHealth Alliance, right? That was to the tune of about $14-15 million over a number of years, right? The Defense Department funded EcoHealth Alliance to the tune of about $42 million. Oh, my goodness. And USAID, which Bobby Kennedy says is a CIA cutout, which I believe, to the tune of $50-some million. Oh, wow. So Fauci's funding was less than the Defense Department and USAID/CIA. So that tells you something. Again, that was information I didn't know till I read Bobby Kennedy's book. Okay. Yeah. So again, more and more information is coming out that's just obvious, kind of like the JFK assassination. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you read books on that right now, there's no way you can't come to the conclusion that, if not directly responsible, certainly involved. I mean, this it was not a lone gunman. There is no way it was a lone gunman. And then you find out, who ran the Warren Commission? Well, that would be Alan Dulles.
Yeah.
The fired head of the CIA who hated Kennedy.
This is the last topic I expected to get to.
Well, again, so
it's awesome though. I love it.
Well, again, so I didn't come here to be an investigator.
Yeah.
But I became chairman of Homeland Security, and then March 2015, as soon as I became chairman, the Hillary Clinton email scandal broke. And not only am I chairman of the Senate Oversight Committee, that's what governmental affairs is, federal records is under my jurisdiction. You had to look at that. And it's the same cast of characters that exonerated her, that edited James Comey's exoneration email, turned into Crossfire Hurricane. I mean, it's just one great continuum to, the FBI with their, what they call the task force that is basically a catch and kill operation. They find out, anything derogatory about Hunter Biden, and they go in there, they kill that information. And that's what they do with Chuck Grassley and I. In August 2020, during the midst of our investigation, we had an unsolicited briefing by the FBI that said, you guys target Russian disinformation. Now, this is after 6 months of us being accused of soliciting, disseminating Russian disinformation falsely by Democrats and by the media. It's like, okay, do you have new intelligence here? I mean, you got something, can't share that with you. That's when I say, okay, who told you to brief me? To this day, I still don't know. Wow. I have no idea. They won't, interagency. Okay, there are people who directed this briefing. They won't tell us.
Yeah.
So again, I've been subject to their misdirection operations as well.
So last question on the vaccine stuff in particular. We're
kind of wandering here, aren't we?
Yeah, it's awesome.
But let me tie that up. Okay. Yeah. So for your listeners, if you want to go down the path I've gone, okay. So that's where I started my investigations, and I've been involved in all these investigations ever since, right? And I'll continue. But read JFK and the Unspeakable. Okay, that's, again, it's written by a real lefty, so you kind of got to get through that, but there's solid information that is eye-opening. Read The Devil's Chessboard. That's about Alan Dulles' CIA. Just throw in there The Creature from Jekyll Island is pretty good, about the cartel that is our Federal Reserve. Okay, those are just some good books. If you want vaccines, Dissolving Illusions, Turtles All the Way Down. Read Bobby Kennedy's The Real Anthony Fauci. Now read his new The Wuhan Cover-Up. Read Rand Paul's book.
Yeah.
I mean, there's good, solid information, and your eyes will be open, and that's the whole point. We need more Americans' eyes open to what government is doing to us and how thoroughly corrupt and pervasive the deep state is.
So on vaccines, and I think this is really eye-opening, is what do you think the motivation was behind? I mean, it was basically forced vaccination, right? Like you were ostracized if it was not something that you got. What's the motivation there? Is it the money? Is it the control? A little bit of both?
So you really need to depose Bill Gates and figure out everything the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has funded, how they've taken over through their funding, control over these global institutions. These guys actually talk about these things openly, what they want to do. Mass vaccination campaigns. I mean, the level of control that would provide people. So again, I don't have all the explanations here. I just see all the incredibly troubling things that are occurring in our society that are taking away our freedom. I mean, look at how easily Americans rolled over to shutdowns, to vaccine passports. Are they going to do the same thing to digital currencies? I mean, we are losing control of our lives. We're losing our freedom. And there's a game plan out there. And again, I'm not sure there's some massive conspiracy, but there's a group of very elite people that exercise far too much control over our lives. And, I would point to people like Bill and Melinda Gates, the Klaus Schwabs of the World Economic Forum. What are they trying to do with these amendments to the World Health Organization pandemic response, to take away sovereignty? I mean, these things that we need to take a look at. The problem is, I had an amendment to deem any agreement with the WHO a treaty. So it'd have to come before the Senate. We can debate it, and we can decide whether we want to turn our sovereignty over to a corrupt world organization like that. Every Republican voted for that amendment, except for the sponsor of the bill that I was amending. He didn't want a poison pill. And then every Democrat voted against it. I mean, that's concerning, that U.S. sovereignty is a partisan issue. Border security is a partisan issue. Unfortunately, mortgaging our kids' future is a bipartisan
compromise.
The Unit Party supports that pretty well.
So
I know this is all scatterbrained,
but it's important because it goes to the heterodoxy that you're providing in DC, which we need so much more of. You laid out this chronology of the moments where government really acted against the public interest in the late 20th century, going all the way through the COVID pandemic. I think one of the biggest things that makes those two eras different is the role that corporate power has played in these 21st century efforts, specifically during COVID. So much of the COVID regime was potentiated, secured by big tech or by other forces. How are you thinking about the corporate power element of all this?
Well, I really think we had a far less biased media back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And if anything, they were, the media then was attacking conservatives. Mm-hmm. Now the media is, well, I mean, the protests were coming from the left against government stuff. Now that's all switched. The left is totally on board with the government. So you had a more inquisitive media, pushing back on a host of different issues, more suspicious of government because government was controlled by, at that point, conservatives like Dixon, that type of thing. And so you need a media that's unbiased, that's going to hold both sides accountable, that is inquisitive, that investigates things and roots out corruption. Now you've got a media that is by and large part and parcel of big government and the radical left. So I think the real shift occurred, and I always talk about the masterstroke of the left, is they took over the university systems during the Vietnam War protests. And so now you have the radical left, and they are radical. Okay, take a look at the three university presidents testified before Congress. But they're the radical left, so they control all the colleges, but in particular three impact our culture. Law, so they're cranking out a bunch of lawyers, become activist judges, and I would say exceed their constitutional authority far too often. Rather than arbiters, rather than apply the law, they alter it. But then you take a look at colleges journalism. We don't have journalists nowadays. We have some, but by and large, you have advocates for the left coming out, and they invite me on, whether it's CNN or Chuck Todd or whatever. It's not to interview me, to argue with me, gotcha questions, that type of thing. So it's not journalism that actually reveals things. It's journalism that advocates. And then probably the most corrosive thing is we are graduating indoctrinators. And so there's still good teachers, but I mean, when you take a look at the indoctrination that's occurring K through 12, and then of course it's just icing on the cake when kids go to college. It's awful. Mm-hmm. And so that's had a tremendous destructive impact on our culture, which is why now you have, students that are protesting in favor of Hamas, who just brutally murdered in the most horrific ways. I mean, I can't even bring myself to look at that video. There are enough things keep me awake at night. I don't need to see that. I've read the description. That's horrible enough. Okay. And we've got American students basically protesting in support of that, not outraged by that slaughter. So anyway, to me, it really all began in terms of the downhill slide, our slouching toward Gomorrah, our road to serfdom, all started in the 60s in the universities, and that's going to take a long time to reverse. Absolutely.
One of the other issues that you've been very active on, especially in the oversight realm, is, you were paying attention to Ukraine, long before this Russia's invasion started. Would be curious to hear kind of your arc of how you understand that country, the American response in the war, and what needs to happen next. Zelensky was just wandering around D.C. yesterday.
I first went to Ukraine as part of a larger trip in 2011. We visited Georgia, Saakashvili, and then went to Ukraine, then went up to the Baltic states. It was interesting. And back then, it was all about corruption in the wheat markets and, corruption in the media and that type of thing. I mean, corruption. I mean, it's a former Soviet satellite state, and corruption is just endemic in that system. So it's hard to rid those countries. Fast forward, then I got in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I became chairman of the European Subcommittee. So I start making trips to Europe quite a bit. And I've been to Ukraine probably 6 or so times. I was the only member of Congress who was at Zelensky's inauguration. I think he genuinely wanted to destroy corruption in Ukraine. But he's a political neophyte. The long knives were out immediately. I know when I met him at the inauguration, then 2 months later, I went back with Senator Murphy. I mean, he wanted to do a peace deal with Putin. He realized it'd be challenging because Putin had annexed Crimea and controlled Eastern Ukraine, but he was pretty realistic going, I'm not going to be able to root him out of there. A lot of Ukrainians, Russian speakers in Eastern Ukraine probably like to be allied with Russia. I mean, a lot of people in Crimea were. So it's like, I can't undo that. As much as we'd like to, and as much as we want to say that that's just unacceptable, he wanted to do a peace deal with Putin. Now, I will tell you, it was not helpful the way Democrats utilized Ukraine in their impeachment. That was not helpful to Ukraine. If you support Ukraine, the impeachment was awful for Ukraine. I mean, it's just highlighted and, polarized, American support for whatever. I don't think Putin ever would have invaded Ukraine with Trump in office. He never would have done it had we not surrendered in Afghanistan and showed that weakness. He wouldn't have done it with an open border. If we didn't have an open border and 40-year high inflation and war on fire. I mean, all these things that Biden has done has so weakened this country and emboldened our enemies. So that's when tyrants choose to act. So they did it. I think we could have, even late, we could have dissuaded him from doing that by just a very strong declaration. We're not ever going to invite Ukraine and NATO. We could have put some tripwire NATO forces in there. I mean, we should have done everything we could to deny him that invasion. But then happened the courageous Ukrainian people. I say Zelensky too. I mean, he had a free pass out of there. He didn't take it, even though he had crack assassination squads after him. So you got to give him credit for that, right? And I think most Americans are highly sympathetic with the plight of the Ukrainian people. I mean, they want to be free. I mean, we understand that. I actually voted for the first $40 billion support to try and signal to Putin, end this. You failed. Stop. Okay? This isn't good for anybody. This is just a lose-lose-lose situation. He was back on his heels, but again, I don't think Biden pressed as fast as he could have, so we missed that opportunity. So now here we are in 22-month bloody stalemate. I mean, Ukraine cannot win this war. Let's put it this way. Russia won't lose the war.
Yeah.
I mean, losing the war is existential to Putin. He has nuclear weapons. He will use them. In order to win the war, Ukraine would have to start inflicting damage on Russia. I mean, lobbing missiles into Moscow to get the Russian support for the war to decrease. So it cannot happen. So it's a bloody stalemate. This will end. The only way it ends in a negotiated settlement. Every day that goes by, more Ukrainians die, more Russian conscripts die, and I take no joy in that, and more of Ukraine gets destroyed. So end it. Stop adding fuel to the flames. I mean, I don't like saying I'm not going to like the result. We're not going to like the result. But every day that goes by, the result gets worse and worse and worse. Recognize that reality. If there's a problem in Washington, D.C., is just the denial of reality. I'd say that's the main problem with liberalism. They deny the reality of human nature. But in this case, I mean, we're just denying the reality of the situation, fighting a proxy war, and it's Ukrainians and Russian conscripts that are suffering. And we glibly talk about, no Americans are dying. Well, God, other people are. Mm-hmm. Doesn't that offend you? I mean, I find it's depraved. It's offensive to have people claim, the beauty of, $60 billion, that's mainly going to go to jobs in America. I don't know. I don't think jobs in America are worth the destruction of a country and the slaughter of people. It's sick the way this thing's going. Again, as sympathetic as I am, and I think most Americans are to the plight of the Ukrainian people, how evil Putin is, and he is a war criminal. Mm-hmm. I mean, the war crimes committed, the atrocities. I mean, we're every bit as bad in Ukraine as what Hamas did to Israel. Okay, so we're not going to like the result. We're not going to get justice on that. Mm-hmm. We're just going to get more slaughter as long as this thing goes back. So yeah, I've got a different view on this. I'm not an absolutist. So what I proposed is, okay, Biden, if you want $60 billion for Ukraine, I would actually vote and promote that as long as that funding is contingent on and only flows as you meet the benchmarks of securing our border. Because that's a clear and present danger. I mean, our unsecured border is a clear and present danger to America. It's not just impacting New York. It's impacting small towns throughout America. They're inundated with migrants who, by the way, most of those migrants in a legal system, we'd welcome them. They want to come here. They want to work. But in a legal system, they also are forced to assimilate. In an illegal system, they're abused by their sex traffickers, human traffickers, drug traffickers. I mean, it's out of control system. So again, what I'm proposing, I think Republican red line on this ought to be is, okay, you want the funding, we'll give you some up front, As long as you pass the bills, remain in Mexico, safe third country, change the asylum standard to, more likely than not, you have a valid asylum claim, and more likely than not, you're telling us the truth. I mean, that's kind of our orthodoxy in terms of what we need to do for credible fear improvement. And then on a monthly basis, over 12 months, secure the border. That's what it took Trump 12 months. Once he had to remain in Mexico in place, and it took him 12 months to go from peak to trough, from about 144,000 encounters to about 17,000. It's entirely possible. So you kind of let $5 billion a month flow based on reducing the number. By the way, right now it's about 250,000 people a month. Well over 6 million people. That's 31 states have populations less than 6 million. Wisconsin's right at the bubble. We're that 31st state at 5.9 million. That's the magnitude of the problem. And it's growing. 1.7 detected gotaways. 1.7 million detected gotaways. We have no idea. They call them known gotaways. I don't like using that term because we have no idea who those people are and we have no idea where they are. Think there might be some sleeper cells in here? You think maybe we've got some Iranian sleeper cells that could be activated if we more aggressively retaliate against what Iran militias are doing to us in Syria and elsewhere? This is, and again, and what are we talking about? We're talking about, Democrats won't even sit down and negotiate in good faith on this. And, I love the Wall Street Journal, but their ed board's publishing things that'd be a win-win if Ukraine funding and modest immigration reform. No, we actually have to secure the border. This isn't about immigration. This is about securing our border.
They're like, cool, amnesty opportunity. No.
And ending a clear and present danger to this nation. And anybody that doesn't recognize this as a clear and present danger, it's just destructive to our society. Again, we're a nation of immigrants, and I've been in the border, and so many of those people are just, your heart goes out to them, and you want to help them truthfully. In a legal system, we should welcome them. We don't have enough workers in this country, but it's got to be controlled. But this is going to be unbelievably corrosive and destructive to our country. What's already happened, and we continue to let it happen. That's why Republicans, we just have to dig our heels in. We've got to show leadership on this.
I'm going to ask you to play a little bit of armchair psychologist. What is it that leads to so many people in D.C., Republican and Democrat alike, to care so much more, it appears personally, about what's going on in Ukraine than what's going on at our southern border?
Yeah, I think there is a bubble here. I think most members do get out and they talk to people in states and stuff. I don't know why they don't make the connection with what their constituents are actually telling them. Do they read the Washington Post too much? The New York? I don't quite get, but there is a bubble here. And you get back into town and we're not talking about the bigger issue. Why aren't we talking about critical race theory? Why aren't we talking about, why are we pushing transgenderism on our children? Again, the lie the left tells us, the Republicans hate. No. We have true compassion for anybody that has true gender dysphoria. What we're opposed to is our education system telling impressionable little boys and girls that you might not be a boy, and all of a sudden we have this explosion of people who are gender dysphoric. Mm-hmm. That's so. No, so why aren't we addressed? Because when I go back to Wisconsin, that's certainly what conservatives are concerned about. They're concerned about the fact that this nation is circling the drain right now. They're concerned about the open border. They're concerned about that $1 they held at the start of the Biden administration is only worth 85 cents. They're concerned about the war on fossil fuel. They don't want EVs. If they did, they'd buy them. Mm-hmm. Okay, they want to be able to take a trip and not have to plug in every 150 miles. Okay. Again, it's mainly a disconnection on the part of Democrats, I would say. But, listen, I think Republicans, many of them are also just divorced from the reality situation, what's happening in this country and really what Americans are really looking for. But you also have to understand how many Americans are poisoned and, by the mainstream media, by the leftist views, and, how they're just not made aware of these things. The mainstream media has done a pretty good job of just keeping the whole border situation off the front page. Can you imagine if that was a Republican in office? Just true, So again, I do largely blame the media for those two, our education system and the media. That's the problem we have they control the information, and control the information is powerful.
Absolutely. So, Senator, we've talked about the debt and fiscal situation. We've talked about, the COVID response, and we talked about Ukraine. These are all issues that, you were ahead of the curve on. And so I'm going to ask, what's the thing that you're paying attention to right now that no one else is, that everyone will be Johnny come lately on next year? What's 12 months from now? What is the thing that people are going to finally be listening to you on? What are the hidden threats to the country that you're really paying attention to right now?
Well, we really haven't talked about the debt deficit issue the way we should. Mm-hmm. And that's going to rear its ugly head. The fact in 2002 is where we passed the $2 trillion a year Rubicon. 2019, 17 years later, we 4.4. Now we're 6.4. And that's, a $2 trillion increase in just the baseline spending. Big chunk of that is just inflation. You've got the automatic COLAs to the entitlement programs. It's not sustainable. You'll have it is a fiction. It's just an accounting gimmick. The Social Security Trust Fund. It's a U.S. government bond held by the U.S. government. It's a worthless piece of paper because they turn it over to the U.S. government. The government just has to float another bond. And as we're trying to do that now, creditors are demanding a higher interest rate because they realize we're a credit risk. So this blows up in our face eventually. And it can collapse violently and very quickly. I can't predict it. So we're a highly affluent society. I think we're going to have a real hard time coming to grips with what really happens in a true debt crisis. But just go down the road. We know the fiction of the Social Security Trust Fund runs out, 2033, 34, 35. At that point, and I think most people expect that what trustees have to do is they have to reduce benefits to equal the revenue flow in. Right now, they think it's about 75%. The question on the table is, will we have the financial wherewithal to plus up the benefits to honor those promises? That's a big question. I would be highly doubtful that we'll have that financial wherewithal because we may have already hit a debt crisis. So, most people in Washington, D.C. are just whistling past that graveyard. So, well, probably won't happen on my watch. I think I'll retire this year. So again, it's just being ignored. And, when for example, during my campaign, I talked about how, we need everything on the budget. Now, I use which means everything, I hate to say the word, but I'll get in trouble again, would be in the discretionary part of the budget. That immediately gets twisted. Oh, he wants to put Social Security in the chopping block. He wants to make it,
throw grandma off the cliff.
No, what I'm saying, that's just the budgetary terms here. Mandatory spending is not even looked at. Mm-hmm. Okay, it's just automatic. Yeah. You can't do that. No family does that. There's certain things like mortgage payments, kind of in your family budget. There, mortgage payments, kind of mandatory spending. Okay, you got to do that if you want to keep your house. But everything else pretty much discretionary. We have way too many things that are mandatory, and we've got to start looking at this budget as a whole. We've got to be looking at the deficit. Last year we had 2 years ago, it was about $1 trillion. Now it was listed as 1.3 because there's $333 billion that was counted as spending from student loan forgiveness, which was ruled unconstitutional. So we got it back. So the 2 year ago deficit was $1.3 trillion, so $333 billion higher than it actually was. So it was actually $1 trillion. This year's report is 1.7, but it's really 2. If you really just ignore the whole issue of student loans. So we went from a $1 trillion deficit 2 years ago to $1 trillion to $2 trillion this year. And there's no end in sight. This is clearly unsustainable. But again, because it just the calamity hasn't occurred, inflation eased. That's what ought to keep people awake at night. A debt crisis is going to be ugly.
Do you think that when people go to the polls in 2024, the economy is going to basically look the way it does now, or is there going to be a crisis that is informing their choice?
What's such a disconnect? We haven't had a recession, mainly because we don't have enough workers. Mm-hmm. Again, that's the big problem in Wisconsin is the people who want to hire can't. Now, there's a host of reasons for that, but people haven't come to grips with that. The political rhetoric is, we need jobs. We got all kinds of jobs. We need workers. Okay, and there's two ways to grow your economy. there's two ingredients: financial capital for productivity gains. You got to have the machinery, and you have to have workers. We don't have enough workers to grow our economy, and we need to grow our economy at least at 3%, at least to have any chance of escaping a debt crisis. So the economic pain people are feeling is really that the hangover for the inflation. Again, that's a permanent damage. It's not the percentage and it's up high and now it's down low, so now everything's good. No, because it was high, the damage has been done.
Yeah.
Your dollar's now worth 85 cents. Social Security went from 1.2 trillion to 1.3. Interest rates from
Coca-Cola's
300
not going back to 99 cents.
No,
it's just not going to happen.
It's permanent. I mean, my meal deal at McDonald's, it used to be $5, it's always 12. And I always get vanilla shakes, that kind of boost. That's just my extravagance.
What's your McDonald's order, Senator?
Either the chicken sandwich or the quarter pounder, no cheese, no pickles, no onions. Just ketchup.
You're not a Filet-O-Fish guy?
No, I don't think I've ever had one of those. I love fish. I'm a walleye fisherman, but that's fresh caught and then eaten.
Yeah.
Obviously, if Chick-fil-A is open, it always seems like I want to go to Chick-fil-A on a Sunday.
Yeah.
I go, I can't.
I do this all the time, like driving back from church. We drive by one on the way home. I'm like, oh, we can stop at Chick-fil-A on the way home. And my wife's like looking at me from the passenger seat like, really? You're not thinking ahead.
Senator, where can people keep up with everything that you're saying? You're the most censored senator on social media, I believe. So it's harder, but where can they keep up with everything?
Well, my Senate website is just ronjohnson.senate.gov. I mean, Twitter, I'm on it. I mean, go find me. Just type in Ron Johnson or Senate Ron Johnson. I don't keep those handles in my brain.
Yeah. Have you ever thought about creating, an account just for you, like Senator Mike Lee did, or you could say even more what you really think?
Well, I think I'm saying quite a bit now what I think, right?
Yeah.
I always have.
Yeah.
I'm sure this podcast get me in trouble. Depends on what you clip and it gets blown out of proportion here.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, listen. The public needs to know the truth. They need to have people give an honest evaluation. Now, am I right on everything? As much as people call me a conspiracy theorist, those things I've been talking about, there's not one thing, quite honestly, when it comes to COVID that I've been proven wrong on, including the whole issue of gargling, which was really grotesque. I mean, I'm on a telephone town hall. This is Omicron. People are taking it not as seriously as they should. I'm telling them to take it seriously, but there's things you can do, whether you get vaccinated or not. I mean, vitamin C, vitamin D, gargle. And that got turned into Senator Johnson. I mean, literally, the trolls are on there. All of a sudden, my comm shop gets contacted me. Why is he saying that Listerine will replace the vaccine? Of course, I didn't say that. Was a week-long story of ridicule, including they went up to New Hampshire. Thank you, Governor Sununu. What do you say about this wacky Republican senator says that Listerine will replace the vaccine? And Sununu's quote was, "When crazy knocks on your door, slam the door in the face." Okay. Thanks, Governor. Thanks for giving me the benefit of the doubt. So anyway, a long senatorial answer to your question of where my website is. Sorry.
Thank you for coming on the podcast, Senator.
Thanks for having me.
Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. We certainly enjoyed having Senator Johnson on. Again, thank you to his fantastic staff who really led in making this happen. They wanted to see him on the show, and we were more than happy to oblige. Thank you guys, as always, for listening. We are going to be taking a little bit of a break before season 4. Lots to do here at American Moment as we enter the new year. It's going to be a very, very exciting year for us and a ton of new initiatives to come. I mean, between National Conservatism Conference, our year-long programming, all this crazy stuff we're doing, we're certainly keeping busy. But look, there's a giant backlog of this show for you guys to dig into over the Christmas season. So be sure to go back and listen to them. Almost all of them are taped in a way such that they are evergreen. So thank you, as always, guys. I mean, Nick, thank you for taking over the show whenever I'm out of town, trying to raise money to keep the lights on around here. It's always very helpful. Do you have any parting thoughts for our guests before the end of the season?
Don't do anything that I wouldn't do. And we're saying Merry Christmas again.
So true. We only say Merry Christmas here at American Moment. And then, at some point, when the delightful day of Kwanzaa arrives, be sure to go to my Twitter. It's the most fun I have all year. Kwanzaa is my favorite holiday.
So,
it's
definitely real. Definitely not a fake holiday.
Thank you guys as always for listening. And we will see you guys next season.
Moment of Truth is an American Moment Studios production filmed at the Conservative Partnership Center. Our podcast is produced and edited by Jake Mercier and Jared Cummings. Our intro music is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich. Don't forget to like and subscribe on all platforms, and you can go to AmericanMoment.org to learn more.